Jim is up at, like I said, Tall Timbers up in the Panhandle, near Tallahassee. And he's going to speak to you tonight about the Bachman sparrow and the brown-headed nuthatch. And I know you're going to be fascinated, and feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll go over those at the end, and we're going to have a great time. So thank you. You can go ahead, Jim.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the invitation to provide a little bit of information on two birds that I've spent most of my adult life with intimately. Tall Timbers, as most of you know, is up in the northern, right before you go out into the Panhandle. We have two properties in North Florida, one the core property north of Tallahassee, and we have a property over in Jefferson County. And also just south of you now down, we have Escape Ranch, which is just near U-Haul Junction. And if there's any interest in getting down there and birding sometime, let me know. It's a property donated to us recently by some people. And we have some ongoing work down there with butterflies and red-cockaded woodpeckers and some of the species I'll be talking about tonight. Let's advance. Oh, sorry. So most of our work, focused on the use of fire and how it is so important in the longleaf pine ecosystem at the southeast. This is a system that was shaped by fire, and it's very frequent fire. Some people are surprised to hear us recommend that you burn every 2 years or more frequently. But really, for this, what we can tell from the species we've been working with, that's a very good frequency to be using now in today's landscape. If you look at the historic flash density, these are lightning bolts per kilometer square. We're in a region which received a lot of lightning, and those of you in Central Florida received a heck of a lot of lightning strikes over the time. And these were the things that launched fires regularly back before humans were here, and using prescribed fire to mimic the effects of the lightning established fires. What these fires create is this very wonderful open grassland with towering longleaf pine above it. It's really a savanna with these trees superimposed, and a lot of the diversity is from your knee down. It looks like a pretty uniform forest, but really it's one of the most diverse systems in North America. Some places have as many as 40 to 50 species per square meter. And sometimes you can get down to, in some wetland areas, you have 50 or so different species per square meter. We have one property on near Tall Timbers. It's a native ground cover, unique old growth longleaf forest. And we've recorded over 600 different species of plants on the parcel so far. When you remove fire, things go down quickly. This shows one of our study sites. We call it MB66. In the top there, you can see how it looked back in 1966. This was a place where fire was removed, and the basic things that happen after removing fire have been monitored now for over 40 years. Real quickly, all these hardwoods began to move in, as you can see there in the picture showing 1981, just 15 years later. And by 2001, this was looking like a hardwood thicket without any of the grass and any of the longleaf pine sitting there. You can see the A there representing the same tree in the different pictures there. But basically, when you burn, what you're doing is catching these hardwoods before they can grow up, and you're basically top killing them. And each year you're top killing them again and again. But if you don't burn, then they can eventually get ahead of you and get up to where they can dominate the mid-story and the lower areas there where things like Bachman sparrows and other species nest. Must be a little bit of delay here in how this thing is moving along. Okay. So here's the first species we'll talk about. I did it in reverse order of what's proposed there. Bachman, brown-headed nuthatch first, Pusilla. This is basically a big head with the minimum amount of feathers and musculature needed to move that head through the forest. It's a very kind of cute looking bird and has a lot of interesting behaviors, which we've been focusing on for our work at Tall Timbers. We work with color marked populations. So if you see these birds kicking around, this is typical foraging behavior for the nuthatch. They whirl around upside down, sideways, finding food, pecking at things that are on the limbs and the branches. And really, they probably study trees better than any other species of bird because of the way that they forage. They never let go. They're not trying to fly catch things. They're really studying the cracks and crevices of each tree, trying to find food to eat. There's a lot of variation in the birds. We know that you can sex individuals now based on their calls. I'll play one here. That's the male's call. And the females have this little twitter note that they give. They also have a call that sounds a little bit like the males, but this is a more common female call, which sounds like a bunch of little twittery notes. So if you ever see a pair of nuthatches working around, you can be sure to listen to those twittery notes versus the more emphatic calls of the males. They're also really curious. They're one of the only species known to use tools. We have seen this a lot of times in tall timbers where the younger birds take these little slivers of bark and use it to pry open the scales on pine trees and find bugs underneath. They also cache seeds too, in winter in particular. They grab seeds from the pines and they'll haul them off and go to a place on a pine tree and stuff them up underneath the bark. And this is a really kind of elaborate kind of behavior that we've watched as they come back to those trees and forage and pick out the things that they've stored there later on in the year. But particularly this caching behavior is really common along coastal areas in Florida. We'll talk a little bit. This bird has been declining in Florida pretty precipitously over the last several decades. It's been eliminated from 7 counties along the Atlantic coast, and the decline is about 78% for the last several years. It's stabilized in recent years, but this bird has been eliminated from a lot of areas in South and Central Florida from what once occurred. I'll talk a little bit too about the other subspecies. There are mainland populations we have, the ones that we work with, the Pusilla, but there's also a subspecies in the Bahamas that I'll be talking about a little bit too, because we've done a little bit of work with that these too. It also has a sibling congenit species, the pygmy nuthatch out west, which has a lot of behaviors as well too, similar to those of the brown-headed nuthatch. But again, we were basically in our area, the mainland population and then the population of Bahamas, which was for many years considered a subspecies, but we have been providing data to suggest it's really a legitimate species. So what we do on tall timbers each year, we find a bunch of nests and we follow them, who's breeding there. We color mark individuals, so we know whether it's John or Jane breeding at the nest that year, or Frank and Francis. We basically follow about 200 nests each year, color marking the young, following the results around, really getting ourselves kind of into the knowing a little bit more about how the individuals are operating on the landscape. You can see some of the marking systems that we used here. In the lower left-hand corner shows a bird that has been marked with a light blue on its right leg, excuse me, and then aluminum over red on its left leg. And you can see above some nestlings that we band. We can band them around day 10 and put color marked bands on them as well. So we spend a lot of time roaming the fields, looking for these color marked individuals using spotting scopes and binoculars, and really developing a feel for what they're doing. And it's not like some of the radio telemetry that a lot of people use to follow birds. In this case, we have to actually put our eyes on the birds to recognize them. So we also are able to see a lot of interesting behaviors when we do that. This, for example, is a video of a juvie. Start running. It's just banded. This is light green over blue on left leg, and it's got a red anodized aluminum band on the right leg. It's climbing up and scurrying about on the tree here, on the stump here. In a second, you'll see it being fed by a adult. And this is actually being fed by its brother, not the parents of this particular group. I'll get into that in just a bit, but these are cooperative breeding birds, and sometimes the young males hang around with mom and dad for an extra year and help them raise additional young. These are the typical nest sites on tall timbers. They're very low stature snags, close to the ground. They really are very poor excavators, so they need the softest wood that they can find, which is generally some of these decaying snags that are during the last stages, before they actually disappear into the ground. But sometimes they can use these snags for many years. This shows a snag that has been used for over 4 to 5 years by a single nuthatch group. Each year they create a new snag, and but sometimes they'll use these stumps for many, many years repeatedly. Based on our marking too, the oldest females we've ever seen is about 8 years old, and the oldest male is 12 years old. We've actually recently documented the fact that males at about 9 to 10 years old start to senesce. And that means that they aren't participating as much in the feeding as young, but their younger males, their sons, are actually ones that are dominating the roost there, which is kind of an interesting inheritance thing, similar to some of human societies. Okay, and this is excavating a cavity. Shows a nuthatch. They do a new cavity almost every year, even if they're using the same snag that they used the previous year. And this is a very important thing because they're primary cavity excavators, and our excavations attract the attention of a lot of other species, from chickadees to bluebirds to gray-crested flycatchers and titmice. You don't have white-breasted nuthatches down here in Orlando, but they also are another species up in our area that use the excavations that are created by the brown-headed nuthatch. There's also a lot of interest in some of these cavities too. Here comes a male feeding a female, and suddenly there goes a male. Eastern bluebirds are very attracted to nuthatch cavities because they have done all the work, and now the eastern bluebird wants to try to take over. In this particular cavity, you can see the interest is very large. The eastern bluebird can make use of that cavity very easily. So depending on how tightly the nuthatches excavate the cavity, it can sometimes attract undue attention from eastern bluebirds. One thing that we've been interested in, as I mentioned, these are cooperative breeders, and these were the first species for which the behavior was described. It's interesting to me, you know, people think about Florida scrub jays and red-cockaded woodpeckers and all these other cooperative breeders. But back in the 1950s, this was one of the first species of birds for which the behavior was described. There's a very important paper that was published by Alexander Stutch back in 1958. And you look at this paper, and he references, there's no reference to red-cockaded woodpeckers. There's 2 references to Florida scrub jays, and the brown-headed nuthatch is mentioned 6 times rather, because of back then, it was one of the first species for which this entire behavior is described. And this is one of the things that really fascinated me about trying to work with this bird, was that the fact that, you know, it was long-term studies of Florida scrub jay and archibald, red-cockaded woodpeckers throughout Florida. But no one's really established a long-term study of the nuthatch, and that was one of my goals about 20 years ago when we began this work. One of the reasons we think they're cooperative is because females have lower survivorship. So in any population, there are fewer females than there are males. The issue arises because females, the excavated cavity is sometimes very low to the ground. This is literally a cavity that is excavated that's only about 1.5 feet off the ground. And only the females incubate and brood young. The males feed the female in the nest, but they do not help with the incubation whatsoever. And what we oftentimes find is this is a case where a flying squirrel got into the nest and depredated the female that was incubating the eggs there. And more frequently, we find this sort of situation where a gray rat snake or a red rat snake has climbed into the cavity and devoured the female and the eggs. And so the survivorship for females is lower than that of males. And it creates a situation where there are more males than females. And so that's one of the things that might be driving the cooperation, is that males, or there are enough mates out there on the landscape, so we decide to sit with mom and dad for a year and hopefully find an opening somewhere nearby. They also improve nesting success too. This shows a group of 3 nuthatches attacking a red-headed woodpecker model that we've attached next to the nest. Cooperative groups also are more productive than pairs, even older pairs. And so this is another thing that cooperation helps out with, is the fact that they're being more productive and then you try to go it alone. Oops. Well, the other things too is get this going. They're so social. Again, I mentioned it's like watching great apes. This is a group of 4 birds that are grooming one another, and you can see them doing this for 20 or 30 minutes sometimes. You see that one individual move in there against the other individuals, and they just start grooming each other about the head and about the back of the head. It's really kind of, again, looking like at great apes at such a miniature scale. That's cooperative breeding. I want to talk a little bit about conservation efforts that we've done with this bird. Here's the way Florida used to look for nuthatches back then when the Spanish anchors first fell in Florida waters. This is the distribution of pinelands back in the 1400s or so. Very extensive, and this nuthatch was found throughout most of the counties in the state, and very common. Here's what it looks like today with all the fragmentation and habitat loss that's taken place. And we've really lost status with this bird in southeast coast of Florida, where this bird has been eliminated from 5 counties there in southeast Florida, going down to Miami and into Martin County and those areas. It's still doing well around your areas. But for example, looking at Polk County there, the bird has been decimated in Polk and Hillsborough County, as well as on the southeast Atlantic coast. We've done genetic work with this bird. We find that there's a unique kind of genetic signature also along this coast, Atlantic coast there. Basically, we found 3 distinct groups in Florida doing this genetic work. A North Florida group, which you can see is blue. The group in Central and Southwest Florida is green. And then also the Sebastian Island group that is basically red and distinct from all the other three. And we think this represents what may have been a distinctive Atlantic coast genotype. You've got the Indian River separating the habitat there along the Atlantic coast from the mainland there. And you can see this fragmentation that occurs between that and the other populations in the interior. And we believe there may be some lost populations on the Atlantic Ridge that also had this genetic signature with them going down all the way down to Miami. So one of our projects recently is trying to replicate, reintroduce some of the nuthatches to that former range. There are a lot of good areas down there that can support the nuthatch. And for the last few years, we've been translocating birds from St. Sebastian River Preserve down to areas in the south, along the southeast coast. Particularly Jonathan Dickinson State Park. It's got a ton of good nuthatch habitat. It was kind of cut over in the late 1950s and 1960s, but the woods look great now. So we've been moving nuthatches down to Jonathan Dickinson over the last 2 years, trying to reestablish the birds down there. And the population right now is taking hold and doing pretty well, and we're going to be continuing this for another 2 years. Here's a release of nuthatches. Basically catch them up at St. Sebastian, haul them down 90 miles, and we just simply release them on Jonathan Dickinson. This is male, female being released.
Okay, now you do yours, okay? Sitting on the perch,
They're sitting on the perch in that poop. How could you have any better?
Turn it sideways. Now there's a little perch. That's the female.
So we'll be continuing this for another few years, as part of our conservation effort is to reintroduce this bird to as many places as we can, particularly that Atlantic coast kind of unique genetic signal there. We've had great luck so far. 5 individuals the first year we released birds into the second season, and we've had the first successful nest on Jonathan Dickinson the year after we did the first releases on over 60 years. So right now we have about 6 groups there, and we're going to continue to release 3 to 5 pairs down there for the range for another 5 years or so. Another type of nuthatch is restricted to the Grand Bahama Islands, and I want to divert a little bit to look at that species because it's really a kind of a story where it's a unique species that was not recognized early enough along to do much conservation-wise. The birds have very distinctive bills. In the upper right-hand picture here, you can see the nuthatches there in the Bahamas have a bill that's about twice as long as the bills on our nuthatches here in the States. That's the one on the left. They also have a very distinctive note. Here's what the male sounds like. It sounds a little bit like our birds, but we've actually done some tests whether our birds recognize that call. And the answer is they don't recognize it. They don't respond to it as well as local birds do. So the calls at this point are kind of very specific to each of the populations. And that coupled with the differences in the bill length and some genetic data we have has led us to propose this as being a different species. I was finally adopted a few years ago, but unfortunately the species is now extinct. We had about 4 or 5 individuals that we saw down there where we visited in 2012. And a recent visit in 2018, discovering the island, did not find any birds there whatsoever. Fortunately, we got some genetic samples from the birds in the Bahamas. This is a little, basically a blood sample that we take when we catch birds sometimes. And we basically can show too that there's a unique genetic signature down there, as well as the unique sort of behavior in response to the calls that I just demonstrated. And this is Heather Levy's work, and want to read about more maybe in conservation and ecology as a description of all the stuff leading us to think that this is a distinct species. Slipping over to Bachman sparrows, a bird that doesn't spend much time in the trees, but plus it's down on the ground. It's also like the nuthatch, declining throughout its range, about 2.3% or so throughout Florida. This shows the atlas distribution of the birds. It's pretty well distributed, but again, it's also missing from many areas down in South Florida. The bird has very complex vocalizations. We've been working with a lot of this bird. We actually have discovered that the females have a song. The birds do mimicry. You know, everyone knows the primary song, but also the bird has this very complex song that it gives what we call the excited song, where it has a little bit tapped onto the end. That maybe excited something for you. We'll build up there. But oops, let me stop it again. So it has a little kid here, kitty kitty that people recognize, but that chatter at the end is the most aggressive song that the males sing. And they actually sometimes do what we call a whisper song when they're very close to another male that's intruding in the territory. They'll decrease the volume of that down to where you can barely hear it. And that is actually the most aggressive song whatsoever whenever they're challenging a male. He also did some mimicry. This is an example of a Bachman sparrow mimicking bunting. It should be. We've observed them mimicking yellow throats, common yellow throats, and we even had one year a bird we called the wren bird. It perfectly mimicked the Carolina wren. We tried to catch it and band it so we could identify it using color bands, but it eluded us for 2 or 3 years, but we could still tell it was a unique individual because we heard the Carolina wren call that it was mimicked. This is again in combination with the red-cockaded woodpecker, the Bachman sparrow plays a very important role in sort of defining high quality areas in southern pine forests. The red-cockaded woodpecker, as you know, requires mature trees, but the Bachman sparrow is so dependent on very frequent fire that it really is a very great indicator of where you have a well-managed forest throughout the southeast. A recent study by John Turpak and others said if you wanted to predict the species richness of all the birds that use our pinelands in the southeast, Bachman sparrows and red-cockaded together could do the best job of indicating that. And this slide just shows that the species richness of these two increases with increases in the Bachman sparrows and red-cockaded woodpeckers. So if none of those species, if you're not doing anything else but monitoring Bachman sparrows and red-cockaded woodpeckers, you're getting a good picture of what's happening with the other species in the forest. And the reason for this is in southern pine forests, most of the ground nesting species, about 40% of the species that are in these forests are ground and shrub nesting species. And the Bachman sparrow requires extremely frequent burning to make a go of it. Up in the mid-story, about 24%, and in the canopy, 32%. The great number of species that are associated with that ground shrub level makes the Bachman sparrow a very important indicator, along with the red-cockaded woodpecker. I mentioned the NB66 here, where we actually, remove fire, and you saw the change in. Here's actually the data here. Bachman sparrows disappeared from that site just in 2 years after fire was removed. We have some sites in our area that we've studied now where the birds basically occupy it from about 2 months after burn up to around 12 to 14 months after burn. And after that, they begin to look for new territory. Now, one of the questions people have about Bachman sparrows is the relationship between the bird's nesting habits and also the application of fire. In this graph, I'm showing you where natural fires tend to occur in Florida. We have this period in late March through early June where things dry out in Florida. And that coincides with the period where, as you've seen about the late yellow lightning bolt there, lightning strikes start to happen. It's thought that a lot of this burns in Florida happened in this sort of April through June transition period. And this also tends to be a time when Bachman sparrows are nesting. And a lot of people have a lot of concern about applying these fires in a sort of natural period when they would occur regularly, and what the effect they have on the Bachman sparrows. So we started looking at that. Basically, when the fire comes through, it's a big pulse of high energy heat. It gets up to around 1,000 degrees, and then it just basically moves on very quickly. It's only for a few seconds there that the fire is so hot. It basically is just hot enough to kill off the shrubs and brush, but it doesn't affect the ground cover below the plant material below ground. So all the roots and everything are still there present to resprout after the fire takes place. And also, the seasonal component has a very dramatic influence on how different plants respond. On the left of this photograph, you see a portion of this area that was burned on April 10th. And on the right, you see it burn, a portion of the area that burned on April 27th, just 17 days later. What you're seeing on the right is the flowering response of wiregrass, again suggesting that these fires came through sort of in that late April through June period rather than in the early April and March period, which you see on the left. Wiregrass some plants just will not flower unless you put a fire through a spot in that sort of late April through May or early June period. And this gives us again the wonderful open pinelands that we used to have. We looked at Bachman sparrows and this sort of burning in that time period. People thought it was very bad. There's conventional wisdom think that sparrows didn't do very well. One study found that they dispersed and never returned. They found survival and reproduction lower, no breeding activity, and densities were lower. And they just suggested that burns in this time period, which were natural, could be affecting Bachman sparrows terribly. And Stoddard even himself, one of the most gifted naturalists ever in Florida, said nothing is more destructive to ground nesting birds than summer burns. Well, we looked at this carefully on the way track of wonderful old growth longleaf pine site that we get to study up in our area, banding sparrows as we did with the nuthatch and looking at them real carefully and looking at what happens when you actually put one of these burns in during the breeding season, carefully marking males. And for example, this is one of our favorite males, 1177. He was light green over orange on its right leg and then red over aluminum on its left leg there. And this bird, if you can see on the left-hand portion of this slide, occupied this area from 2003 to 2007, doing pretty well. The area was burned during the lightning season, 03, 05, and 07. And the bird seemed to handle it very well. But our last sighting of this bird occurred in 07. We found it about 1 kilometer south of the place where it had been all of its life up to that point. In 07, we were planning to burn this area, but we couldn't get to it early enough, and this bird abandoned the area before we could burn it. And our thinking is here that actually the bird couldn't attract a mate because the ground cover was too thick, and basically was giving up on that particular spot and trying to find more groundwork to find attract a female and engage in reproduction. And this is where it's really important, rather than just watching birds, to understand how the reproduction has taken place in a population of these ground nesting species. The nest of Bachman sparrows on the ground, they build these wonderful cup nests that they always stay south so that they're sort of shielded. And we found 90% of our nests in areas that have been burned in the past 10 months, but only 10% in areas that have been burned in 18 months or greater. So these females are actually looking out there for the most freshly burned spots to place their nest. We actually quantified this using some techniques, this disc drop and other things that we did to measure the vegetation. And the key point is that the sparrow nest is very, very ephemeral. The conditions that are suitable for it, they basically are looking for areas 2 months that are about 12 months to 14 months after you burn. And then when you get to that lower left, and the vegetation has grown up and sort of folded over and started to really clog up the ground cover, the females have abandoned it and moved elsewhere. This actually shows the plot of the percent of bare ground. We measured these plots at different times post-burn, 2, 8, 12, 16, and 24 months, 20 months after, 18 months after burns. The data for the nest sites are there. So basically, as you can see from this plot, which shows where the standard, very rare stuff is outside of the squares there, the rectangles. Once you get past 12 months, you're starting to lose conditions if the females find suitable. So when you think about a 2-year interval, you're not burning nest up. All the birds are nesting in the site that you burned last year, not the site that you're planning to burn this year. So why did this bird leave? Again, it probably couldn't attract a mate to its place there up in on the way track, was trying to find greener pastures. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this bird is we base a lot of our inferences on it based on singing males. Paired males don't sing very frequently, as this slide shows. Singing males are screaming at as loudly as they can. So when you walk into an area and you hear a bunch of singing males, you may just be reporting the loser males and not the males that are actually paired and being reproductive. We also wanted to address the question about the scale burn. The study that we conducted there was a very small scale burn. It was only about 100 acres, and now we're burning thousands of acres each year. And so we had another separate study with Bachman sparrows looking at this issue, again using the same techniques, color banding birds, and looking at them on 2 properties. The properties here that we looked at on the left is Pebble Hill, where you can see the orange, alternating orange and green, which represent the burn units, are smaller than they are on the right-hand side, which is the way tract. We have this one large burn unit that has been burned, alternating from year to year. That's a complex slide here, but the basic idea is that, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, if you're burning a large area, you're affecting a large number of nests initially, but you're also leaving a lot of nests that aren't tampered. If you're burning smaller scale burns, you're affecting actually even more nests, but you're also not being as detrimental to the nest that you're hitting there as well too. And so we're looking at this just to see what the scale of burn effect had on the birds. These show some of the points we had on the way track. Again, we go out weekly, 4 or 5 times, and recite the color marked birds for their locations and build up a very great depth of data on where they are and how they're using these sites. Basic issue is that we've then started looking at the birds that we've had 12 locations for prior to burns, and those we had 12 locations on after burns. One of the factors that we look at is whether or not the bird moved. So this shows a home range calculated for an individual sparrow. The red dots of red crosses indicate before the burn, and the blue dots indicate where the bird was after the burn. And we actually look at the centroids of those two polygons that are created there to estimate how much the bird moved. In this slide, you can see large scale versus small scale and how much the bird moves. It's not any different from one side to the other. The birds are moving just as far with the small scale burns as there are for large scale burns. Again, suggesting that the scale of burn is not that big a deal for this bird. And we even looked at the home range side. This also did not vary significantly among the plots there. You know, the area that the individuals were using on the large scale burns is the same as it was on the small scale burns too. So again, the scale of burn at the extent that we looked at did not affect sparrows' use of the area very dramatically. And this should be a calming, very good information for people who are out there conducting burns. We just do not need any more impediments to conducting birds during the time of year when we can do it. We're steeply behind and burning a lot of areas in Florida, and burning into the season when the sparrows, quote unquote, might be nesting. It helps extend the time that we have to conduct burns. And really, there aren't many nests out there that you're going to be affecting. All the nests, again, are the area that you burned last year, and not the area that you're planning to burn this year. The other thing is with the smaller acreage, it takes a lot more time to conduct a burn. Sometimes if you really squeeze the acres down to like 200 to 300 acres, it's inefficient. And one of the biologists on the Appalachian National Forest complained about this, that when they were doing these smaller scale burns, it took them 5 days to burn the acreage they would normally burn in a day. And again, we are very seriously behind on meeting the frequency of fire that's needed on a lot of these sites, and this could be an impediment if we're continuing to burn in small scales. The other side of this, though, too, is with small blocks, you can burn a small tract when you don't have time to do 1,000 acres. So there are adjustments that can be made, for smaller blocks, but again, we need to get the acreage up, and the best way to do that is to be burning at larger extents. So what we found with this is basically, with everything else considered, the burning at that time of year did not have a dramatic effect on the bird, improved habitat conditions, and importantly for this species, the survival of adults is much more important than the number of nests or young that they produce in a given year. They can continue to breed after failing to breed for 1 year, and if you have an adult that has high survivorship, it can make up for that loss very quickly by breeding somewhere else. The other thing too is that predators are dramatically reduced in areas of the burn, and we didn't look at this very carefully, but nesting success is extremely higher for a lot of ground nesting birds in areas that are recently burned versus areas that haven't burned recently. Also, just for Bachman sparrows, just like to point out that the breeding season is longer than the non-breeding season. The earliest nest that we've ever found on tall timbers is March 20th, and the latest nest we found was nearly in October this time of year. So these birds can make up for the lack of breeding early on by breeding, having this very long period over which they breed. One other thing we've noted too is we've conducted counts for winter Bachman sparrows, and basically the birds there too are also using the most recently burned sites. All the red dots here show where we found 0.75 or 1 or greater sparrows occupying the site in winter, and the yellow show the areas that weren't used as frequently. So again, the more frequently you burn, the better you are just for the bird in winter as well as during the breeding season. Finally, winter fires can also be destructive for other species. Brown-headed nuthatches nest early in the year, and if you burn at that time, you're going to be burning up their caddy as well too. So I'm not saying don't burn then, but just that there are disadvantages for other species too. When people think there are only disadvantages for ground nesting birds when you burn at that time, there are other disadvantages for other species earlier in the year. If you're interested, a lot of this stuff about lightning season birds is encapsulated in a wonderful brochure that we put together many years ago, and it's still available online. You can scan the QR code there to find it, but it really lays it out for a bunch of different species, how important lightning season burning can be for a lot of these birds that we normally think you're tearing up the heck out of when you burn in that time of year. And most importantly, lack of fire is the disturbance, not the application of fire. These pinelands evolved for 20,000 years where fires were coming through every 2 to 3 years, and this is the frequency with which fire is needed to maintain the conditions that are suitable for a lot of these birds. And the only way we can do that in today's age is to apply prescribed fire at a similar frequency. So I'll pass the baton back to you at this point. This is a look at the wade track, my favorite place to be to study a lot of these species, but we really have a lot of information we provided about the importance of fire to these two species, and I hope you take it forward. And whenever someone talks about smoke going up sometime in May or April, and they say, gosh, they're burning up on this bird, you can say, wait a second, that's not quite the way it is. It's a little more tricky and a little more complicated than that. I'll be happy to ask any questions that there might be out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Jim, we did have one question.
Okay.
Oops. And hold on, it just put a thing on top of my question. I am chatting as a guest. Hold on. Oh, Julia wanted to know, do nuthatches cache in a few spots in their territory, or do they only have a few major caches?
It's a few spots. They tend to pick one tree and stick most of the caching seeds underneath that one tree. And we haven't really followed that up very well, but the caching actually seems to be more prevalent in coastal areas for some reason than in our population. I watched nuthatches in a coastal area, and they spent 4 hours when we were camping there, caching seeds underneath the bark there. And we haven't really followed it up. We don't see quite as much on tall timbers, but it's a common behavior, particularly in coastal areas in Florida.
Huh, interesting. Now, also, Julie wants to know, is the Bahama nuthatch extinct?
Yes. There was a follow-up survey done, and they found one lone male in, I think it was 2018. And so the bird is extinct at this point.
Oh, that's bad. And she did ask it before you talked about the reintroduction if you were going to be doing the nuthatches, but you did cover that. So,
well, it'd be nice to have gotten there earlier. You know, the nuthatches in the Bahamas, they were pretty common back in the 1970s, 1960s, and there's plenty of habitat on the other islands. It's just that they couldn't reach it. And it would be nice to have undertaken some of the work like we're doing, you know, at Jonathan Dickinson, moving the birds around, but it's a little late for doing that right now.
wow, that's too bad. Any other questions?
And you can unmute yourself if you want to just ask a question and not type it. People are thinking.
Well, I have another actually off-topic question. You mentioned you had a new property in.
Yes, we have it's called Escape Ranch. It's just north of the Yeehaw Junction, and it's about 20,000 acres. And actually, there's a property north of there that is considering a donation to us as well too. And it's been owned by some wealthy people who realize that they only need it for 10 to 12 days each year when they're hunting. And they're not using it the other 340 days a year, so they donating it to a not-for-profit. It gives them a tax break, and they can still do what they're doing. We're down there right now working on woodpeckers, and maybe it's a little bit early to tell, but maybe down the road something where we can think about doing some work with Florida grasshopper sparrows. There's some ugly prairies down there that are very close to being suitable, and with a little bit of work might be nurtured to be another spot where that sparrow can take hold.
Ooh, that's kind of exciting. Um,
Kathy and I took a workshop there from you all on the bobwhite.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's neat property.
Yeah, and I got to go there in the 90s when they had just introduced the whooping cranes. It was there.
Yeah.
That was the first site.
We're just starting to get, the woodpecker Rob Meyer is the guy who does most of the woodpecker work for us, and he's been down there regularly. He's also a butterfly enthusiast. And I don't know if we ever have a crew that wants to go down there, we'd be happy to come down there and show the property to you and take a little more look. I haven't spent much time there because I'm really kind of spread thin as it is. But over time, we want to have an investment where we have some more of our type of bird work taking place down there for sure.
very cool. Oh, Cindy wanted to know, and I think she said, how do you locate the nests? And I think that's referring to the Bachman sparrows, the nest.
Yeah. The Bachman sparrows give a very distinctive note when you're near a nest. It's an alarm note. I can send you what the note is, but that's really how I found most of the nests. I'm just walking along and all of a sudden I hear this and I know that I'm basically within 5 meters of the nest. The other tool that we have, and this was what tool that we had when we were working with grasshopper sparrows as well too. We have a trained dog who can sniff out nests, and I actually had this dog trained purposely for this finding nest for the grasshopper sparrows that we were working on as part of the Florida grasshopper sparrow work, and she works great. She's retired now. She hasn't been working because we haven't been doing as much Bachman sparrow and grasshopper sparrow work lately. I don't think it'd take a while to retrain her. She's about 11 years old at this point. But when we were working with the birds, she found all the grasshopper nests in 1 year. You just send her out and she's trained to sit whenever she finds the target. And we found everything using her.
That's cool. But
The other
she
thing
retired, huh?
Well, I stopped working with the sparrows, the grasshopper sparrows a few years ago, and the Bachman sparrows a few years ago to focus on red-cockaded woodpeckers and nuthatches. So, and she's about 11 years old. I haven't taken her out to see if she still has her stuff yet, but that's what we used for many years. They also have distinctive, you watch them carrying food and material, and that's another way to find nests. And the thing is, when you see a Bachman sparrow carrying food or material, you basically have to run away about 50 meters away, sit down quietly, unobtrusively, and watch the bird. And when it grows to take the material to the nesting location, you count to 30. And then you get up and you start running to the last place that you saw it. Because they basically land a few feet from the nest and they walk to it. And if you give them enough time, they'll be there placing the food or the nesting material, and you can find the nest that way too.
That's funny. Nice.
All right. That's all the questions. Excellent. Right. Well, we really enjoyed this. This is
Yeah, that was good.
so
I
interesting.
think I might like to see you running to find those nests. That would
Yeah.
your coworkers were entertained. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.